Hi everyone, today's topic is a paper published by Eric Kamait-Freixas, who is a professor in the Department of Modern Languages at Florida International University. His paper, titled Cognitive Theory of Simultaneous Interpreting and Training, talks about the mental processes and techniques used by interpreters during their work. To begin with, we should discuss some information regarding the focus of this paper, which is simultaneous interpreting. The author considers this interpreting to be the most demanding of all modes of interpreting because of two main reasons. In the first place, the interpreter cannot control the flow of the communication. He must adapt to the pace of each speaker and must follow the ideas presented in the speech, since he will not be able to ask for clarifications or just for repetitions. In the second place, all processes occur really fast. Here, the interpreter must follow the ideas given in the speech while formulating and delivering equivalents and also monitoring his output to identify any errors. Now we will mention some principles and techniques that each interpreter must take into account while interpreting simultaneously. According to the author, and as many of you may already know, all interpreters must focus on meaning and not words. An interpreter's job is not to translate words, but rather reconstruct and restate the meaning. In this way, interpreters listen and understand the source language message. They make the meaning their own or become the speakers, and restate their ideas in their own words as if they were the speakers all along. When this process of understanding and restating happens, we find ourselves dealing with two concepts. The first one is a schema, which results from abstracting the concept of a word or a situation. In other words, a schema is a mental image. The second concept is terms, and they pretty much explain by themselves. So to wrap up, we should focus on restating schemas and translating terms when interpreting simultaneously. Once that we are clear that interpreters should restate meaning and translate terms, it is possible for us to go over the step-by-step process of simultaneous interpretation established by the author. The main objective here is to identify a specific simultaneous interpretation tasks in which we have trouble. We should work on them, master them, and practice them all together as a whole. Firstly, we encounter the area of fluid listening. Active listening, as we all know, is the base of all interpreting processes. We cannot interpret what we have not heard, understood, analyzed, or abstracted. Therefore, our listening should be fluid, but also flexible, in a way that it allows us to attend to other tasks while without truly tuning out. Besides, we should listen in a state of relaxed concentration, letting the words flow through us while we follow the meaning, without letting our attention linger on a word or idea. Secondly, we find the area focused on empathic analysis. Here, the interpreter plays both the role of listener and speaker. On one hand, he gathers the ideas he may or may not agree with that have been stated by the speaker. On the other hand, he becomes the speaker itself by taking ownership of ideas with empathy for their way of thinking and renders the message faithfully. Thirdly, we spot the area related to segment recognition. A segment is the shortest possible unit of meaning, which contains enough information to be interpreted unequivocally. The author suggests that segments should be as short as possible so that the interpreter can render them quickly and move on with the interpretation. It is also important to add that short segments can be chunked together into a larger segment or compound unit of meaning which later will help the interpreter by maximizing its memory. At this point, we can say that segments are fluid quantities whose length can be expanded or contracted at the interpreter's convenience to make the interpretation clear and the task easier. Fourthly, we notice the area that concerns with how we manage decalage. The author defines this term as the amount of time that the simultaneous interpreter takes to process, formulate, deliver each segment. In this context, the author also mentions that the length of both the segments and the decalage can and should be managed to have a successful simultaneous interpretation. However, of course, there are times when the interpreter is forced to lag further behind in speech, either because the speech was too dense or because the speaker was just talking way too fast. And this is what we call forced decalage. And it usually comprises a minimum amount of one segment. In general, it is advisable to maintain the decalage to a minimum in case that something in the speech happens and forces us to just lag further behind. Then we will have enough room to recover and pick up the pace again. Nevertheless, good interpreting sometimes requires us to do the exact opposite, which is increasing the decalage. And this technique is called cueing and it involves stopping the interpretation for about 2 or 3 seconds and listen to what the speaker is actually saying before rendering the message. Here the interpreter is able to catch up with the thread of meaning thanks to the use of shortcuts during the interpretation. Overall, as we can see, managing segments length is important in order to always follow the thread of meaning in a speech.
The production phase is where we have abstracted the source message into pure thought or conceptual schemas. Now, to produce the interpreted message, we first formulate, then we compare and adjust, then we monitor, and finally we deliver a clean message. In the first one, while we are speaking, we put together the schemas and terms into expressions that sound idiomatic and natural in the target language, taking into account a logical and grammatical structure too. This is about to construct speech, while speaking, finding the words as you go along. Now, when we compare and adjust, here actually is a process where the interpreter, pressed by the time and many other factors, just look for the acceptable equivalence. The interpreter here must be comfortable with the close enough because excessive comparison and depth might compromise the delivery. Now, when we are talking about monitoring, this process does not actually involve any information processing because it has already been processed and delivered to the audience. And it's actually a kind of passive listening where interpreters learn to monitor themselves in order to make a quick self-correction if necessary. So at this point, I think it's important to mention that that formulation, the adjustment, the delivery, the monitoring, and well, these are actually a phase of the profession, and it's actually really important to mention that. Now, when we talk about the clean delivery, here each phrase or segment should be formulated and delivered with fluence and confidence, avoiding insecurities with the tone of voice, the volume, and make the communication meaningful and appropriate to the audience. Now, talking about managing selective attention, attention management must be selective during the simultaneous interpretation due to the fact that human information processing operates only in a single channel at a time. Based on the breaking wave model, interpreters focus more on formulating the speech and directing it to a listener or audience. Now, according to a theory, there are different types of attention. The first one is primary attention, also known as active attention or the focus, where we have to keep our mind centered on formulating without discrepancy. And in the secondary attention or fringe, or also known as peripheral attention, in fact, what we call monitoring is simply the conscious use of peripheral attention here. If everything at the fringe remains normal, no action is necessary, but as soon as a discrepancy is detected, our focus needs to instantly shift to it in order to resolve it. There's also troubleshooting types. There are actually four of them. The first one is during extreme killing. Here, actually, the interpreter stop all speaking functions and concentrate 100% on listening and understanding due to an audio problem, maybe lapse attention, and if it's a recurring problem, it should be brought to the attention of the speaker or the moderator, or maybe to the sound technician. Interpreters should consider the different listening problems that may arise and know how to respond to them. The second one is during moderate killing. Here, is actually a necessary technique to deal with dense segments of the message. Interpreters may consider to summarize or choose shortcuts and try not to compromise the accuracy. The next one is reformulating. The syntax must be reformulated because the syntax, as everybody knows, in each language is different. And the last one is self-correction or self-correcting, where interpreters should avoid self-correction and insecurities. Otherwise, it's going to be a distraction that affects the interpretation and the message as well.
So now we'll talk about the third point, is contrastive syntax and prediction in simultaneous interpreting. The first thing to talk about here is syntactic manipulation. According to the author, many interpreters usually focus on terminology and don't realize that syntactical differences between languages are just as important for simultaneous interpretation, for effective segmentation. The author recommends that interpreters should include in their glossary a section about contrastive syntax in order to have the comparison of the typical patterns of each language and their equivalencies. During simultaneous interpretation, it's best to maintain the original structure as closely as possible, so the interpreter does not have to spend the extra time and concentration rearranging the syntax. In order to achieve this,
Interpreters have to do syntactical manipulation exercises that consist of rearranging the syntax of sentences in every possible way. Some of the English structures that might be challenging when interpreting from English to Spanish are the multiple adjectives and adverbs, the prepositions at the end of a sentence, the clauses of purpose, etc. The second thing is prediction. Prediction is the ability to anticipate the conclusion of a segment and the direction of the whole speech. It allows the interpreter to pay more attention to formulating and at the same time continue to monitor the listening side. And once the prediction is verified, he can proceed with interpretation. There are some types of prediction. The first is syntactic prediction, which consists of anticipating how a phrase or a sentence is going to end. The second is semantic prediction, and this is the anticipation of meaning based on the context and what we know about the topic of the speech. And the third one is the pragmatic prediction. This is the combination of the syntactic and semantic predictions. This can allow the interpreter to anticipate different styles of sentences, paragraphs, and speeches. By having the ability of anticipate and follow ideas of the speech, the interpreter remains immersed in the speaker's speech. Now we'll talk about incremental training methods. The first is to make a diagnosis. According to the author, before the interpreter starts incremental training, it is necessary to conduct some diagnostics. In order to do this, the interpreter has to record his or her practice. Then, evaluate the practice based on a relevant criteria. And finally, the interpreter has to make a self-diagnosis about his or her performance. After that, the interpreter should push his or herself to achieve a higher level and then evaluate again and keep track of his or her progress. The author also recommends the interpreter to determine his or her weaknesses and sources of inefficiency. And all of this is not only for beginners, it is also for professional interpreters. These professional interpreters should self-criticize so their proficiency won't decline and their interpreting performance won't become limited. So now we'll talk about some exercises that the author recommends at the end of his paper. These exercises address specific simultaneous interpreting skills and tasks. These exercises can allow an interpreter to realize which of these skills or tasks need some improvement. Some of these exercises are: first, focusing on meaning and not words. This exercise is about restating the meaning of a sentence in the interpreter's own words and trying to avoid the original words and syntax. This exercise has to be done in each language, from Spanish to Spanish, from English to English, and then from one language to another. Another exercise is interpret silently. This is about the interpreter to make the interpretation silently in his or her mind without speaking and only stop to note down all the things that gave him or her trouble and then analyze these things and try to work on them. The interpreter can use any resource, for example, a TV program, a podcast, a video, etc. And this practice should be made in all the interpreters' working languages. Another exercise is shortcuts. This consists on the interpreter to abbreviate ideas down to their simplest and most economical form. The interpreter has to determine to what extent ideas can be acceptably abbreviated without affecting the original meaning. Another exercise is managing decalage. This exercise consists of practicing simultaneous shadowing within each language, which means that the interpreter has to repeat what he or she hears and then slowly increase the decalage. Shadowing in his or her weaker language at a high speed can help the interpreter develop fluency and improve pronunciation. Then, the interpreter should practice shadowing while cueing, which means that he or she has to let the speaker get one segment ahead of him/her, and then when the speaker begins to utter the second segment, the interpreter should start shadowing the first, and so on. And then the interpreter has to continue the same way, letting the speaker get 2 or 3 and then more segments ahead, and then do the shadowing. After finishing this, the interpreter should do the actual simultaneous interpretation, minimizing and maximizing the decalage. Another exercise is interpreting non-stop. This consists in the interpreter doing the interpretation without stopping until the end. If the interpreter falls behind, he or she should continue with the next segment, maintaining the meaning. The interpreter should always try not to stop and not leave sentences unfinished so that the listener doesn't notice that a segment has been skipped. Another exercise is selective attention management. This consists of while the interpreter is shadowing, he or she should write down numbers from 1 to 100, and once the interpreter reaches 100, start doing the same but backwards from 100 to 1. And then try writing other things like a letter or a poem or etc. After each exercise, the interpreter should tell the meaning of the story or the piece that he or she just shadowed. All this will help the interpreter to get used to multitasking and will force him or her to manage his selective attention. And this is useful for simultaneous interpreting. These are some of the exercises that the author Eric Kamijn-Freixes recommended. We can find more in his paper Cognitive Theory of Simultaneous Interpreting and Training. Thank you.